Hi, my name is Eric Cohen. I am a former coxswain here at the University of Washington, class of 1982, and also the team historian. And I am here today at the ASUW Shell House on the Montlake Cut with two of my good friends, Michael Callahan, the head men's rowing coach at the University of Washington, and Melanie Barstow, who is the founder of the Boys in the Boat Tours here at the Shell House. So we're just going to jump right into the discussion here, and I want to go to Melanie first and talk about this building. So you have had thousands of people come through this building. Tell me what the takeaway is generally from them, and also what makes this building special.
Yeah, so I would say the minute that they enter into this space, it's this sense of awe and wonder. You know, you can watch them as they kind of wander in. They do this wide-eyed kind of look around the whole building, and it's this audible gasp, which is pretty funny. It's not something I would expect, and the more people that I've brought in here, the more I see them really feel like they've come home. It's this homecoming and this sense of wonder that you can't find in many other buildings or locations throughout campus or in the state of Washington. And I think the special part of the Shell House is that it really reminds us of our home and our roots. This is where so many people's lives were transformed, not only in rowing, but in sailing, and our indigenous communities and friends that started carrying the canoe across the portage from Lake Washington to Lake Union. So it's a special place for all of us, and you can feel those spirits of our ancestors in these walls.
Yeah. So George Pocock's shop, is that a place that resonates with people? I mean, it is almost identical to when he left it, right? I mean, it's amazing to me.
Yeah.
What do people say when they come in there?
I think it's a little bit different. They sense this like, oh my gosh, it's so small. I don't know what they expected, but when they get up into the loft, they see just how small of a space he was working with.
It fit like one shell across, right? And he would work on that. And we've talked about it with the other historians, like how did he get the shell out of there? And it went through that window, right? They carried it down through a window.
Yeah. And I asked the tour friends when I host them, I'm like, where do you think the boats went? And a lot of them are like, did it go out the door?
Yeah, right.
But I think it's for them to be actually in the space where the Husky Clipper was built, and to see again, that place where all of this started is pretty special because it brings them into that history. It makes it alive for them.
I love that, yeah. So a lot of great teams came through here, Michael. Boys in the Boat, of course. What does this building mean to you and the rowing program?
Yeah, I mean, I think you realize this is where the greatness of the Washington rowing program started. We had other boathouses on campus where the team began, but this is the start of its greatness. 100 years ago, this year, 1923, we won our first IRA National Championship.
Right out of here.
Rowing out of this boathouse.
Yep.
And I think that's the beginning of West Coast influence on the East Coast and national rowing. And from there, it only grew. We won multiple national championships. We won, obviously, in 1936 in the Berlin Olympics. We won in 1948 in London Olympics. And I think it's just the point where Washington rowing really came into age.
Yep.
It made a huge influence. And many men, I think the fact that George Pocock was here, probably one of the most foremost knowledgeable people in rowing in the United States at the time. He brought all this knowledge from England, not in just boat making, but also in the craft and art of rowing. He started teaching young men, and then those men who rowed in these boats, the 1923 boats, in 1926 boats, went off to coach other universities around the nation.
Yeah.
So it's the heart of, in a lot of ways, of American rowing in some ways.
100 years ago, first national championship right out of here. Okay, Rusty Callow was the coach. He'd just taken over from Ed Leader and started this momentum. We had Al Ulbrichson, who stroked the 24 and 26 boats that also were national champions. So we started that massive elevation that took place very, very quickly. As a coach, like, how do you, when you suddenly have that kind of talent and that kind of momentum, how do you form that to continue that momentum?
I mean, we all know it's about the people. We had incredibly talented people, committed people to this fine craft. And so I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to mold and take that energy of those people and push it in one direction. We all have to be committed to one goal. And so getting alignment, like I think what we learned about rowing is getting an alignment and pulling for each other and getting everyone to go in the same direction. And once you have it, it's magical, and it's it builds on itself. You get something called the swing. It almost more momentum builds from that momentum you've created, and it's this incredible energy that just keeps building. That's the magic of rowing.
Yeah.
It's really hard to obtain, but once you obtain it, it's very, very powerful. And it's also very easy to lose if you're not careful. And so what happened in that era is that they were able to gain that momentum, gain that swing, and it just built on itself.
Well, one of the shifts that took place then was Rusty then went to Penn in 1927, right? And so Al Olbrichson, who was the freshman coach and very young, had just stroked the 1926 team to the IRA National Championship, suddenly became the head coach, and so there was that transition. Melanie, talk to me about the culture at Washington. You were on the rowing team from 2012 to 2016 on the women's team. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the culture at Washington. What did you feel like that first freshman year about the team?
I think it was a sense of awe and, kind of tying back into these themes of resiliency and fortitude and greatness. I stepped into Callahan and Shell House and the first thing I thought was, oh my God, I'm surrounded by literally greatness. And the history and the eons of rowers that have been through this building is pretty impressive, to say the least. Yeah. And I felt very quickly, I felt like I was a small fish in a big pond, because the team that I was part of, 30% of our team are from international countries, and a lot of people had a lot more experience in the sport than I did. And so I felt humbled, because I knew that this was going to be a place where I could really learn and grow from my teammates,
right,
and also chase something that's bigger than ourselves, which is ultimately the legacy that the boys created, and also our sisters that fought for 50 years ago in Title IX. And it was this sense of, why not us? We have everything that we could possibly need to be successful, and we have our forebears and our ancestors that are kind of watching everything we do, and we want to make them proud.
Right.
And so it's this pretty cool.
So that was the sense when you walked in the door.
Totally.
When you left, did you still have that sense?
Yes, I would say I was a little bit more wise, I guess you could say.
Sure.
From the beginning I was a little bit like, oh, this is so cool. And then
right,
you get into the 2Ks and the
That's
hard
right,
stuff and the dark ages, and
right,
you come out of it, and I think it's an even greater sense of pride because you made it.
Right.
It's a challenge, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's something that I feel immensely lucky that I was part of.
Yeah,
Speak
Melanie,
to that.
to ask, I feel like you immediately feel the sense of legacy.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, there's a lot of focus on the boys in the boat, and there should be. And I think when you're a young man or young woman walking into the Shell House, you realize the possibility.
Yeah.
George Pocock says, "Reach for the stars." That's where champions are made. And it's not just this corny thing that's being said. It's actually true. This is possible here. Greatness is possible here.
Yeah.
And so you feel that. On the other hand, you want to write your own legacy. You want to write your name in the Hall of Fame, a little selfishly, but you only know that you do that with other people that you're surrounded with. So there's this juxtaposition of knowing that there's been this greatness before you, and it's possible, but you're here for your legacy, which is a little bit selfish, but on the other hand, you only do that with a
great.
team and with a crew.
That's how I felt, and that is how I felt. I felt the same way, in one of my 40 years, class of '82. But the exact same feeling, walking into that Shell House, and a sense of making your own way, but also sensing the legacy with all the photos on the wall. You're immediately hit with this idea that there's greatness here. Yeah. And we talk about the values. You just talked about camaraderie, your sisterhood. We talk about the values being camaraderie, team before self, hard work, and rowing to win, right? So that hard work is what you were just talking about. Tell me about the hard work.
I think a story of the hard work was, my sophomore year, and I was on the land squad for a good.
Define that.
Yeah, I love it. Let me back up. So land squad is basically when you're not good enough, you're not fast enough to be with the rest of the team that's out on the lake every day. And so you're basically working your butt off at practice, trying to get a shot and a moment where you can step into a boat and prove that you're worthy of staying in that boat for the season. So it was a good 5 or 6 months of every single day. The crews would leave, they'd get out on the lake, and then they're like, okay, Mel, go take down an erg, and then row on the erg until we come back. And I think that was the hardest part. When we think about hard work, it's not only, that physical tax, but it's also a mental sport as well. It's what am I willing to sacrifice so that I can achieve success, and what does success look like for me?
Wow. George Pocock talked about the mental. He was huge, right, as far as the mental and spiritual side of this sport.
Totally.
And I know there's a large influence of George Pocock still today with what you teach. Talk a little bit about George Pocock and what he meant to this program.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that I think he is our almost spiritual leader of the rowing program. I think you realize rowing is not just science, and it's also art, and then there's another layer, there's soul to it. And same thing, he said that he put soul into every one of the boats he built, his soul. And I think that's what you have to do in rowing too. If you really want to be great, you really have to extend yourself in multiple ways, physically, emotionally, mentally, and almost spiritually.
Fit to use the heart and the soul and the senses for the joy of it. That's what he said.
That's what he said, and with the joy of living. And so I think when you have all those, I almost got shivers, when you have all those in alignment rowing together,
yep.
That's when the boat, sits up out of the water and sings.
Yeah.
And that's when magic happens.
So how do you teach that? I mean, is that a natural thing? Does that just come? Is it an environment, or is it actual teaching?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think we're, recruiting young people that have those qualities, and we give the opportunity. One thing is make sure you give the opportunity to young people to experience that, and then like you said, you're trying to build an environment. In day one, you start teaching about the legacy, our values. You try to guide young people, into one direction and committed to this thing. And you hope that the older ones are teaching also good values into the younger
Right.
people on the team.
Yep.
And and the coaching staff and the alumni and the atmosphere of the lake and the boathouse.
So it's a tradition that flows.
Yeah.
It flows, right, from generation to generation to generation, and traditions continue.
And I think there's a lot of folks on the boys in the boat, and what you realize, those values were there before them.
Yes.
And they're an example of what it could happen. And those same values still are here today that Melanie and I both felt, and you felt as a coxswain, an oarsman, and oarswoman here. And you realize that's why this is a program of greatness. It's something that is continuing over generations and generations.
Yep. Yep.
And George Pocock, to bring it back to him, was one of the few, or helped us build that foundation and understand the true essence of rowing.
Yep. Yeah, outstanding. So the swing. So we've all been in boats where you found the swing. It's not easy to do. I want to come to you and ask you, how do you define this? So this is a big part of what the Boys in the Boat is about, these men who really did have that. And when I talked to Bob Mock, of course, he talked about that time on the Hudson when they were rowing back after at night. It was at night. And he said all he could hear was just the light tapping of the blades into the water and the releases perfectly together. I mean, it sounds like that experience that many rowers do get to experience. It's not all the time, but it does happen. But tell me about the swing.
Yeah, it's the elusive thing, this thing
Right.
we're all chasing. We're all chasing that incredible, moment in time where things come together. And we're probably trying to find that in all parts of our lives, and I think probably a lot of people can identify to it, regardless if you're a rower or not. When things are going the right way and things become a little bit easier, things come in alignment. But it's almost like there's more people in the boat than there's not just 9 people in the boat. All of a sudden it feels like, double that amount of people, and it's almost another member comes into your boat and adds more power to the oars and more distance to the shell every stroke. And it is an elusive thing, but I think many of us have felt it in many things in our lives. And when you have it, you can have it in business, you can have it in your family, you can have
right.
it, and it's just magic.
One thing I've always felt about with the swing is that there's an element of these values kind of coming together, the team before self value and the hard work value. You don't see that swing really happen without those things first being embraced by a team, right?
You have to have a lot of trust in that too.
A lot of trust.
And then I think that's one thing you learn about the Boys in the Boat as an example, is even when Joe Rance went to see Pocock up in that shop just up to my left, I think George told him that he had to learn how to trust himself and needed to learn how to trust the ones in the boat with him and trust the coaching staff. And once there was that trust, there was an openness and maybe a vulnerability, but also an openness to give himself fully to the crew and not just row for himself. And when that level of trust happens, that's when the good stuff happens.
Yep. Yeah. Talk to me about swing.
Yeah.
What's your sense? Because it's different for everybody.
Yeah, I would say it's to your point, Eric, about the hard work. It only means as much as the hard work that you've had to put in to achieve it. And when I think about, my story personally and being on the land squad for, 6 months and then getting out on the lake, and I think it was a couple of months after, I was starting to get in kind of this sense of harmony with my teammates was when I experienced a swing here at Washington. And I can think about, the 6 years that I was on a rowing team, I only experienced it maybe 2 or 3 times, this sense of perfection. And it's true, George Pocock said, it's reaching the divine. And he said, those are the moments that you will remember for the rest of your life.
Symphony in motion.
Symphony in motion. And so I think that for me as a rower, that was what kept me going through the really challenging times, because I had tasted that sense of perfection and I didn't achieve it myself. It was a team effort, and it was, kind of this moment in time where it's almost luck that everyone syncs up and it's just perfect harmony. And then, when it's white capping and pouring down rain, you have that sense of, well, if I don't get out there in this, I might be missing another opportunity to experience that sense of perfection.
I think, Melanie, to echo that, I think what you said is the hard work and the challenge that you had to face, allowed you to experience it later on. I think about Joe Rance and the boys and what they grew up in, the Depression. We think about Joe, he's a houseless young boy at one point. He's by himself trying to survive, learning trust, learning that hard work. And then that probably made it that much more meaningful when those guys all came together in that, in that year. That challenge that they all had to overcome, then to me just that much more magical. And so, I think you felt it in your way, and I have mine, and many others have also. But that's the environment we're creating, hard work,
Exactly.
Challenge.
Exactly. It happens within an environment that's been created that way. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It actually happens because coaches and teachers have built that form for it to happen.
Yeah, it happened right here in this Shell House.
Yeah, George Pocock, in that quote, that Symphony of Motion quote, said, when you're reaching perfection, you're touching the divine. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul. And that really, to me, is one of the best quotes he has of really hitting it, hammering at that center of what rowing can do for the individual within this incredible team.
And that's what it can do for you for the rest of your life.
For the rest of
So
your
your
life,
life.
exactly. Okay, so I want to jump to the women's team a little bit and talk about the legacy now with the women. So we're here, 50th anniversary of Title IX, and just had a celebration just on Saturday, which was outstanding. Tell me about that, and tell me about the culture on the women's team, and is it different at all, or is it the same? Like, what is the culture on the women's team, and what has formed it so that they do things like in 2019 sweep the NC2A National Championships?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very similar to, these ideals and these values that we all really uphold of hard work and resiliency and trusting each other. But I think really that where the special sauce, so to speak, comes in is that sense of, I'm doing it for the people that have gone on and fought hard for me to be where I am today.
Sure, yep.
Because I was able to be in athletics and actively fight for winning a national championship.
Right.
Never had to fight for being able to row a boat. And so I feel this sense of gratitude and of immense sense of I have to carry this legacy forward. And, we have to continue to fight for our sisters that got us to this point where we are today, and make sure to remember that it wasn't always so easy to come down to the boathouse and have our own boats and be able to take them out on the water and be so supported as we are today.
Yeah.
So if anything, I want to make, our former sisters proud of the accomplishments that they've really paved the way for us to be able to achieve.
We just dedicated the Kit Green on Saturday. And Kit was the athletic director who was really the one who formed a lot of the women's sports here in the early to mid 70s. Go ahead and speak to that.
I think the incredible, almost explosion in women's rowing is just phenomenal. It went from just a very few programs, maybe in the 1960s, and now there's almost 3 times the amount of women's programs that are men's programs, which is incredible. That ability to have the opportunity, there's just more rowing going on in the United States. That means there's more junior programs, there's more kids to recruit, there's more opportunity for kids to learn about rowing and what it can do for them in their lives. It has been, it's just this been transformative situation in American rowing, which is just wonderful for everyone. And the UW, I think, has always been in the forefront of that. They're the pride that we should take. The women were, when they won 5 national championships with Bob Ernst in the 1980s, and then when the NCAA took women's rowing on, we were the very first rowing program to win the NCAA in 1997. How incredible is that? And then they've won it 5 times since and swept it twice. That had never been done before. And then also when the famous Henley Royal Regatta in England, the first time they allowed women to row in the women's 8. The University of Washington was the first women's crew to win that. There's so many hallmark moments.
That was in what's called the Remenham Cup today.
Yes.
And is considered the top event for women. So it's the same as like the 77 men that won the Grand Challenge. It's that same level, and we won the first one.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a girls in the boat moment equivalent to the boys in the boat. It's an incredible moment in our legacy as a university, as a rowing program. And even on the men's team, I think for us, we were allowed to have women's coxswains. And since then, Eric and I, we taught, you were a coxswain here, but we've had incredible women coxswains here.
Back to the 70s.
Back to the 70s. And then, and maybe one of the most, inspirational, influential is Caitlin Snyder.
Yep. She
was a coxswain for me at one point and then won Olympic gold medal in Rio. And the fact that we have, women being able to cox men's boats now freely, I mean, it just shows you that if you're the best at your job, you get the job. And that's
Caitlin won 2 national championships for you in the varsity boat.
Yeah,
She was the first one to do that.
Yeah, one of the very best people I've ever coached.
One of the best coxswains we've ever had here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think if I can just speak to that, probably my most favorite part, this is outside of UW, but when I was coaching rowing over at Sammamish Rowing Association, my most favorite, culmination in the training and the days that we were practicing was the character development of our coxswains. And usually what I saw most often were like our female coxswains that were suddenly in charge of guys that were twice their size.
Yep.
It's like, hey, you are half as tall as them and you're younger than them, but you get to, boss them around and take charge.
Let me tell you, that is a leap of faith.
Oh, totally.
I mean, when you first are introduced to that is unbelievably intimidating.
Absolutely.
And I'm a guy.
Right.
It is a different thing. And so, it has been been a great part of what has made men's rowing here at Washington the last 50 years.
I mean, even Bob Mock at one point, recognized
he
when we had
did.
the first women's coxswain, to varsity, and I think you'd just be really proud that opportunity is there. And I know he already recognized it.
Yeah, great segue. So let's talk about the boys in the boat. So I want to talk about some of these guys. A lot of the people that are going to be watching us today are interested in that story. So you've done the tours, the boys in the boat. Tell me about them.
I would say for me, when I think about their story, it really comes down to the little quotes right before each chapter in the Boys in the Boat book that I like to reflect on. And the reason why is because it transcends the sport.
Yeah, it does.
It unites us as humans. And it's this sense of, maybe I haven't experienced that in rowing, but I can really relate to that in a different part of my life. So I usually lead with, I usually go a little bit deep on my tours, and I like to be vulnerable and just say, talk about my experience and almost being cut, but really relating it to these are seasons that we all go through. And these are the seasons that make us who we are and that show us the value of team and of striving for something greater than oneself. So I think, if anything, if I can, reel it back to one theme, it's I'm thankful that Daniel James Brown wrote such a phenomenal book that not only describes our sport so that everyone can understand why it's so special to be part of, but 2, because it shows us those themes that really do unite us as humans, and it's something we all benefit from.
That's great. Go ahead.
I was lucky enough to meet all but one of the boys in the boat.
That's right. They had their 60th anniversary, I think, when you were a senior, right?
Absolutely. And I remember even going to Henley in 1995, and Don Hume came up and said hi to us. And Joe Rance was a guy around the boathouse, and you knew when we were freshmen, you come in and you're kind of I don't know if the right word is indoctrinated, but you had to learn everyone's name in the lineup.
Yep, sure.
You had to know their story, and we used to have a tradition where we'd cut our hair in remembrance for them. Saying that, I think when you when you come to the University of Washington, you learned about their story amongst other stories, but their story is maybe the pinnacle of what could happen here. And we were lucky enough; most of them were still alive, except for Day, I believe. And I remember when Joe came to meet with me and Bob Ernst, and I think Judy, his daughter, came along, and he said, and he brought some things. I think he brought his Olympic gold medal, and he sat down with us in the champions room in the Shell House, in the Conner Shell House. And he said, I think we're going to write a book about our story. And my neighbor has approached me, and we're like, oh, that's great, And little do we know it was going to become the success that it has become. And Daniel James Brown does a magnificent job of telling the story. And I can't tell you how many people say, oh, rowing, I read the book, now I get it.
Right.
And they can then, they realize it's a human story. They realize what you're doing on the water, but it's more about people and humanity. But saying that, I remember when Daniel James Brown, he gave me, Bob Ernst, yourself, a copy of it. It's 150 pages longer than the
Yes.
one that's out in publication.
Yeah.
And I remember the assistant coach, Luke McGee, and myself, Luke called me and goes, "Did you read these first couple chapters about Joe?" We had no idea about his personal story. We knew Joe, the Olympic gold medalist, I think he was an engineer.
Yeah.
And we knew him as a father. We had no idea what he had gone through personally or what any of those boys had gone through as people.
Here's
and
the interesting
humans.
thing, though. You know the personal stories of the athletes that you've had over the
Yeah.
last 15 years. Wouldn't you say you've had some Joe Rances?
Absolutely, and Jane Rance's. I mean, the
Yeah.
students that come here from locally or around the world are same kids looking for education, excellence, place of belonging, a place to
A place
to
of
grow.
belonging, yeah. Yeah, and embrace the hard work and the team before self, and suddenly they're in those values, and they're going to and they succeed here, and then they succeed in life. I mean, it's just a great story. Okay, so we have questions here from our that were submitted to us, and I've taken 3 or 4 of the good ones here. So from Nancy C, I'm interested to learn about the wood that was used to make the original pocock shells. Why did he choose a particular type of wood from the Pacific Northwest, and what were the benefits and challenges of working with that type of wood? I'm going to go to Melanie.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Nancy, for the question. I would say, it's actually a very interesting story. So George Pocock was very innovative with his craft, and it's the reason why his boats were basically unparalleled to any other boat builder in the nation at the time. And when we think about the wood that he used, at the time it was commonplace to use Spanish cedar. And that's just what people used, but it was pretty hard to come by because you had to import it. And when he came down here to Seattle, he kind of looked around and is like, well, there's a lot of Western red cedar here. And so he took it upon himself to learn how to craft these boats out of Western red cedar, which had never been done before and was a very, very, I'd say, big factor in propelling his boat building company forward.
But it was an experiment.
It totally was.
It was the innovation of George Pocock.
Absolutely.
Right? That is what, it starts with Hiram Conabear, who goes
Right.
up and gets George Pocock to move down from Vancouver in 1912.
Yeah.
But this whole thing is about innovation.
Absolutely.
And so when he made that experiment and started using Western red cedar, that changed. Okay, so you rode in cedar shells?
I did. I started rowing in cedar. The first shell I ever rode was a George Pocock rowing shell, in the Potomac River with a coach named Charlie Butt, who was coached by Bob Mock at MIT, which I always thought was kind of a fun circle. But I rode in a Pocock wherry. It was a double. It was a wherry, big wide boat, but it was made out of cedar it was probably built in this shell house.
Yeah. Was it like once he discovered Western red cedar, and then was it also like the finish that he put on it, or what was it that made those shells the best in the world? They really were the best in the world.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, I mean, he had a couple of factors going for him. There weren't any regulations for boat weight at the time, so he could pretty much innovate as much as he wanted to and not have to comply in terms of how much the boat actually weighed, which nowadays very tightly regulated. You can't get away with anything. And so he was able to create these boats that were not only lighter weight, he also had a background, when he first came down here to Seattle, George Pocock was building the seaplane pontoons for the Boeing, the first seaplane that Boeing produced for World War I. So he took a lot of those same innovations that he learned at Boeing, and he's like, boats are similar to seaplane pontoons. And so he applied, you can see on the bow and the stern decks of kind of these similar materials that, when you look at those, I think they're the Model C3 airplanes, you can see that tangible kind of translation between the two. So, and then from what I've heard, and I'd have to, make sure that this is right, but from what I've heard with the Western red cedar, the grains run bow to stern, and because of that, when the boat touched water, the grains would expand and cause the ends of the boat to float up. So his boats,
The camber.
yeah, that camber, had that camber and that kind of magic touch that, 1936, I believe the boys were the only team racing in a Pocock shell, but by 1938, every single other team at the IRA championships were also in Pocock shells. So quickly became the standard of greatness that you wanted to have to win.
Every American shell in the 1956 Olympics was a Pocock shell. Okay,
amazing.
this is from Lee. On April 10th, 1934, the road leading to ASUW Shell House was dedicated as Conabear Way to honor the father of UW rowing. Along with the restoration of the Shell House, should the name of the road also be restored? Hey, that's a good question, Lee. You want to hit that one, Michael? Yes, we would like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless it's replacing another name I don't know right now, but I don't even know if it has a name down here. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Conabear was one of the the fathers of this rowing program, and really transitioned the rowing program from being almost club to being a team that raced intercollegiately, racing against California in 1903. And so, I guess it's 120 years ago. And so, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to pay homage to Conabear in that way.
Hiram Conabear invented the Conabear stroke. How is that different than today? How is it different than what it was? And how is it still part of what you teach and coach today?
Yeah, I think that Conabear himself was also an innovator and also a forward-thinking person, not only with women's rowing or bringing rowing here at the University of Washington, but the biomechanics of rowing. He said that he borrowed a skeleton from, I think, the med school or the anatomy school,
story.
and put it in the boat and started studying how the body would work inside the boat. And he could work with Pocock on that too. Saying that, I think that one of the things he changed is how you use your back at the end of the stroke, the layback, what have you, and he made it more upright and maybe brought it more forward and maybe got the legs more emphasized than just the back, making it from an upper body into maybe more of a lower body sport. And I think we still see more innovation than that today. Pocock's boats had something called ribs inside the boats, and now with carbon fibers and Kevlar and all the space-age materials, we can make the boat itself, the construction of the boat allows us to use our legs even more. And so I would say that we're continuing that. It's still evolving. The shapes of the boats have changed a little bit. The technologies have changed. We're not in Western red cedar. We're more in carbon fibers, and has allowed us to keep innovating that way. But I'd say the leg drive, which is the most powerful part of the stroke these days, is what he was getting at and realizing we needed to emphasize.
It's interesting. He came here as a trainer for the football team, right? It wasn't rowing. He wasn't a rowing coach, and it became his passion. And he did all those experiments, with the bicycle wheels and the skeleton, like you said. He was a bicycle racer too. But it was the fact that he had that passion, and he reinvented the stroke. And I think the very first year that they rode the Conabear stroke, they won their race by 12 or 15 lengths or something. That's how much of a difference it made. It really was a major deal. That was back in the days, of course, they rode 3 or 4 miles.
That's the difference with the Fosbury flop and
exactly.
or using a pole and pole vault that is bending or not bending, a straight pole.
That's
allowed you to propel you exponentially higher.
Really good analogy, and that's exactly the kind of thing. It was, groundbreaking and changed the sport. Okay, this is from Dwight P. In the 1930s, many races were contests over 3 miles. In fact, for a while there, between I want to say like 1923, 1920 through World War II, to the beginning of World War II, it was 4 miles. Conversely, the Olympics were contests over 2,000 meters. So for every 4 years, you had to switch back, right? How was racing strategy impacted by these 2 race distances? Go to you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, the 2,000 meters makes a mile and a quarter, if you will. So, I mean, the race just becomes almost 3 or 4 times longer. So I think the training, you would do even more endurance training if we had to do that today. And I'm sure that's what they were doing. They were doing a lot of long rows, and they were rowing lower stroke ratings. We might have to do the same thing, but I'd still be surprised how high the guys could row in stroke rating. I wouldn't be surprised if my varsity could row above 36 the whole way and maintain length. That's how
so 4 mile race.
That's how fit the people are these days, and women are these days too. I mean, everything's evolved. I mean, the training, the nutrition, the knowledge, biomechanics. So, but I would probably do a lot more endurance training than we are now. I mean, our races on Saturday, we raced against California, and we both went 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And so the races, they were rowing over 4 miles or 3 miles. I mean, 20-some minutes. And so, we'd emphasize a different stroke, maybe a little bit different technique, and we'd emphasize a lot of endurance rowing.
Bob Mock in the 36 national championship, of course, basically held his guys back. And they were 4 lengths behind with a mile left in that race. Would you be like Al Albrechtsen, throwing your hat?
If I was on the train, I'd be throwing my hat. On the other hand, I think they did that in the Olympics too, and so they were good from coming back from behind. That's very hard to do right now. Almost no 8s race internationally is won from behind. I mean, if you gain the lead in the second 500, you're probably going to win the race. And so that was a very risky race strategy, and just showed you the superiority of that boat. And,
Well, they did
and
it-
the amount of trust they had in it too. I mean,
Yeah, they did it in every race.
They did in every
they
race.
Just, they were forced to do it in the Olympic final.
Yeah.
Right? Like they just were handed
Yeah.
this hand of being in the lane six with the wind, et cetera, having Don Hume being sick. Don Hume and Bob Mock, huge players in that. Tell me a little bit about that race. Like,
Yeah.
what do you know about that race?
I mean, I just think it's pretty amazing if you think about how Don was so sick. And the boys are like basically protesting against Al. They're like, we will not race if Don's not in our boat, right? And if you think about, I've read George Pocock's memoir, and he speaks to the challenges that they had when they got to Berlin. And they were supposed to race the oldest and heaviest boat in that German boathouse. And they were given the worst lane. And then there's, Bob Mock and Don Hume that are kind of this dynamic duo, and Joe Rance. And, there were so many factors that were set up so that the Americans would not win that race. And so I think it's very powerful to think about the story of, number one, Al Ulrichsen, thank goodness, saying, heck no, we're not going to leave Seattle without the Hussey Clipper, because that was a huge insult. If you think about, the traditions and the norms back then, when you showed up to a race, if you brought your own equipment, it was a big insult to the hosting team. But Al Ulrichsen basically said, no, we're bringing the Hussey Clipper. George Pocock came with to make sure it stayed in good form and, was protected. And that was our shot for the gold medal.
He's saying that's the only member that still exists now. I remember the end of Daniel James Brown, and he said that, the only member that exists today is in the ASUW Shell House. And, when freshmen come in, I'll bring it all the way back, when freshmen come in, our first meeting usually is underneath that shell. And you make them look up at it, and they're just thinking it's this relic on the ceiling, but they don't know the story yet. And then when they dive into the story, they realize how
And then 4 years later, when they're graduating, they understand it
understand
perfectly,
it.
don't they? Okay, final question. How has the UW, this is from Jim C., how has the UW term rowing legacy changed and not changed over time? So I think he's asking basically, for the 120-year history that we have, how has the legacy at Washington adjusted, changed in that time frame? I'll go to you, Mike.
I mean, imagine that 120 years, and there's some things that generations just bind us all. Like you said, team before self, camaraderie, rowing to win. Those are things that stayed with us for all that time. But think about Seattle from that time now. From 1903 to 2023, here we are, and how much the city has grown. I mean, and I'd like to think, we're an innovative city and an innovative part of the country. I mean, we have Boeing, Microsoft, Amazon, and Washington Rowing, all innovators, all excellence in their fields. Mm-hmm. And this University of Washington, it's a regional university that has global ties and has the goal of being have a tradition and a global excellence to it. We want to be known globally for the education and research and the things that come out of this university, the knowledge that comes out of this university.
Yep.
And that's the thing I think it's changed, is evolving. Like, our kids all grow up now with the internet and jet airplanes. They're all connected to each other, and this whole globe is connected to each other. So I think this region is a global leader. This university is a global leader, and Washington Rowing is a global leader. So you're seeing the best of the Northwest. That story and that influence going around the world too. I mean, there's so many kids that want to row from Ballard, to Boston, to London.
It's a great question, Jim, because it really does go to the heart and soul of who we are, right? Yeah. That those foundational values that Hiram Conaber set here have not changed. Everything else has changed.
Yeah.
Everything else has changed.
I mean, we're not rowing out of red setter boats anymore.
No.
I know that was a very hard transition for this rowing
I was
program.
actually here when that transition happened.
And it was painful. It was painful, this rowing program, from going from Pocock rowing shells or Western red seeded rowing shells to carbon fiber shells.
That's right.
And that transition was tough. And it's
I was
still
in
tough.
the last varsity 8 that raced in a Pocock shell on opening day. The next year we had an Empacher, a Kevlar boat, and honestly, it made a difference. It was a difference.
I think and I think that if George Pocock or Hiram were here today, they would see that we're still innovating. We're not
Totally
living
agree.
in the past, and we're still pushing the envelope of human performance. But on the other hand, we're doing it together, and we have a collective story, and we're all committed to a goal together. And bringing people together is really the important piece of this. The shape of the oar now It might change. It's going to change, and from 50 years from now, it's going to change. And women are rowing here, and we have one of the most dominant women's rowing programs in the world.
The oars we use today are called hatchets. Were you one of the first ones to row with a hatchet?
Yeah, my high school senior year, it looks more like a meat cleaver. It went from a symmetrical, like we call tulip blade, which you might see traditionally.
We rode with tulip blades.
Yeah, now it looks more like an airplane wing, and that's what it's doing in the water. It's connecting the water and giving you better leverage and holding onto the water better, so you can propel the shell forward more efficiently.
And it has made a difference.
It has made. I mean, I think the first time that the guys broke 6 minutes for 2,000 meters, when they were only doing the Olympics, it was in the 60s, and now we're going 5 seconds fast.
5:30.
Yeah, we're going below 5:30 now.
Yep.
And I think when George Pocock talked about the resistance of the water, it's your enemy and your friend. It's the thing that floats you, but also it's the thing that you have to fight against. The resistance against the water is only going up exponentially too. So to go those speeds now, I mean, it just tells you how much, how well trained and powerful and how efficient they are at their rowing stroke.
That's outstanding. Talk to me about the legacy of Washington rowing.
Yeah, I would say when I think about the things that have stayed the same, it's the pieces that you can't measure are what leave the biggest impact on your life. I think it's it's a character development, and it's not the 2K race score, it's not the 10K erg test. It's the things that you're transformally shifted, into a different state of being, and your character is honed through this process of trial and tribulation.
Yep.
If we think about the cedar shells, George spoke to the years, what seasons they've been through of famine, hardship, and disease. And then there's years of immense growth and, huge advances in their fortitude to weather those storms and challenges. So I think that that's the thing that has ultimately, transcended generations, and it's a common theme that we can all come back to. But when we think about the things that have changed, I speak from the women's program side of things. Early 1900s, they weren't ever allowed to race. And there was this you can go out there and kind of have fun, but you're just evaluated on what you look like and how you can maneuver the boat. And to sit here today and say, I had the opportunity to race 2,000 meters, similar to, the men's team here at Washington, and we're all in this sense of equal, and we're fighting for each other, and it's one team, is a very unique opportunity that many generations of women before me didn't have.
That's right.
So I think that from the women's side of things, there's huge advances in, getting to the point where we have equal opportunities to access the sport and fight for each other. And it's such a cool place to, look back on and feel like it is one team and we're fighting for that championship together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the fact that we started together in a lot of ways in 1907 that makes this particularly unique at Washington, that the men's and women's teams train out of the same building called Callahan and Shell House. There's an umbrella there that you can see that is evident about the men's and women's teams having a common foundation, a common, basically start.
I think it goes back to that quote that George Pocock said, that he builds boat to build humanity.
Yes.
And like you said, I think the things that come in between, as so well said, is that it's the character development. It's development of people, back to people. That's the most important thing that we teach here in rowing boats. And that is the thing that's why, Eric and I we're close, even though we didn't row in the same era, and we are too. And you can talk to Joe Rance, who rowed in the 30s, and I rowed in the 90s, and we still have this bond together.
Absolutely.
And we've never rowed with each other, but we have.
Exactly. When I was doing the Coxswain article and talking to Missy Collins, who I'd never met before, and then just suddenly within 2 or 3 minutes, we are talking like we actually coxed together, like we were because we came out of this program together. There's this uniqueness and this bond amongst generations that's really incredible and such a blessing. So I have so much gratitude for that. It is just a wonderful thing. That's going to be a wrap. Thank you, both of you, for your time today and for this great discussion. ASUW Shell House is a beautiful building. It's wonderful that we're here. We're blessed to be here. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I think we're in the presence of the ASUW Shell House here, and it has given so many opportunities to so many young men and women, and I'm so excited for it to continue to do that. A place where people will be introduced to rowing or the water, here at the University of Washington. It's been a place of innovation, a place of gathering, a place of belonging. I think once you walk in here, you'll feel its spirit, its awe, and its connection to its surroundings, and its connection to this university. And I'm really excited to see it being renovated. And we've been looking at it from the water I've been looking at it for 30 years, and I can't wait to see its next step.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Eric, for hosting this great panel, and thank you, Michael, for being here too. You know, it's a huge privilege to be kind of the spokesperson of the story of the boys and sit in this space right on the cusp before it gets remodeled and welcomes the world through its doors. I think that, you know, the first time I came in here, I cried. It's powerful. It's very powerful, and it's this sense of wonder, and it's a place we need to, you know, make sure that we treasure for ourselves, but for the generations that follow, because I feel like we can sit here and be really proud of the innovations that have happened over the last century, you know, 150 years. But when we think about the future, we have no idea, you know, what's ahead, but we have this space that everyone can come back to and have that sense of innovation and this sense of wonder and excitement for what's next.
And draws us back to the other generations that came before us.
Absolutely, and while remembering our roots. And it's a beautiful place, and not many spaces like this still exist, so it's very important that we...
Really well said.
Yeah.
Really well said. Yes, right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.